As the glossary on the first page shows, today what I want to do is take a look at the intellectual traditions of the Renaissance, and particularly the philosophical movements that dominated in the period. We will really be talking about, and this is always a very difficult concept to get used to when you're studying particularly religious history or philosophical history or intellectual history with broadly brushed. And that is that there are several things going on simultaneously. And as I've tried to emphasize in past sessions, a number of people, educated people, are going through a religious renaissance called the Reformation in their objection to policies and culture of the papacy. And others are just going down the rabbit hole of studying ancient sources and getting enamored in reinventing and revivifying ancient philosophical and, as we'll see, religious positions. There are people who are very interested in what ancient Greek sources and ancient Egyptian sources thought about the universe. This was largely restricted to the educated classes, which are in a minority, and particularly to the so-called humanist culture, the culture that focused on the ancient world, renewed the study of ancient documents, and tried to enter into the spirit of those documents. And so what I want to begin with on the first slide is just a quick thumbnail contrast between the medieval world and the Renaissance world in this regard, in terms of philosophical traditions, intellectual traditions writ large. Medieval philosophy had really a status below that of Christian theology. Theology was the highest intellectual pursuit. This would have been true of Muslims. This would have been true of Jews. And so the leading synthetic philosophers that try to explain the entire world of philosophy and don't just focus on minor questions, the great system builders, the Christian Thomas Aquinas, the Muslim Averroes, and the Jewish thinker of Maimonides, Moses Maimonides, each in their own way take up ancient philosophy. In fact, each was very interested in Aristotle in particular, and try to investigate their theological interests, their religious pursuits through the lens of those ancient philosophical traditions. So medieval philosophy was all about trying to shore up and defend and protect and prove the truths of what they would have called revelation, biblical truths in the Christian world. And they did it through, again, this focus of a universe that they conceived of hierarchically. All of reality existed in a great scheme, the great hierarchy or chain of being, with God at the top, and this cohort of angels below, of which the devil, Lucifer, the light bearer, a fallen angel, and then humans, and then animals, and then plants, and then inanimate matter. So the whole world was seen as a kind of historical continuity from top to bottom. The sources for the ancient philosophical traditions had largely been lost in Western Europe, with the separation of the Greek world and the Roman world after the fall of the Latin Empire to the German tribes of the north. So very little of Plato and Aristotle, we've talked about this before, had been translated into Latin. In fact, in the case of Aristotle, probably about 5% of the entire corpus of Aristotle had been translated into Latin until we get to the 12th century, when all of Aristotle and most of Plato is going to be retranslated from this time from Arabic, because the Arabs a few centuries earlier, in the 9th century particularly, had gone on a campaign in Baghdad to translate the Greek sources into Arabic by way of other intermediary languages like Old Syriac. In the Middle Ages, and this I can't emphasize enough, there is a heyday in the 13th century, beginning in the 12th century, but then really in the 13th century and continued into the 14th century, a heyday of inventive, creative, philosophical thinking. They had gotten their hands on Aristotle again. They had gotten their hands on Plato again, and they tried to reinterpret them, to get away from the Christian brand of Platonism that had come down to them through the writings of St. Augustine, who was something of a Platonist, but what they were really getting was the Christian theology in a kind of philosophical dress of St. Augustine. They weren't getting Plato raw, or the many interpreters of Plato that existed in the Greek world and the Roman world during the Hellenistic period of the 3rd, 2nd, 1st centuries BC and the first couple of centuries AD after that. But now, armed with these new translations of Aristotle, and Plato for that matter, they wanted to argue that human reason could be used to come to God, that it wasn't just grace, that it wasn't just revelation, it wasn't just scripture, whether it was the Quran or the Pentateuch or the New Testament, that there was this human capability to reason one's way to the existence of God. The Franciscans, a kind of interesting group because they were conservative in one sense, that their primary impulse was a conservative one, to preserve the preeminence of faith, but they did it by a kind of radical reinvention of philosophical questions. So the Franciscans, like William of Ockham and Duns Scotus, based in Oxford, for the most part, the so-called Oxford Franciscans, they and Aquinas together, not to mention several other really significant figures like Peter Abelard of the famous Heloise and Abelard, or Abelard and Heloise romance of the 12th century, raised new questions that were so radical that everybody had to go back to the foundations of philosophy, which is always epistemology, the philosophy of how we come to know things, to ask the question, how do we come to know things? How does language work? How does mind work? What is a general idea? What is an abstraction? Since an abstraction doesn't exist in the world, like number in mathematics doesn't exist in the world. You have two things, but the idea two isn't a thing in the world. It's an abstraction that we use to describe things. How does this all work? And so the questions of modern philosophy, 19th, 20th, 21st century philosophy, have much deeper roots in the medieval world because they were struggling with the same kinds of questions. In fact, several moderns really pick up with people like Duns Scotus. Then the Renaissance. The medieval world was incredibly creative in the philosophical realm. Renaissance philosophy, meaning the ideas that were fancied by the humanists, in their their attempt to return and recover ancient sources, they cared very little about these novel philosophical arguments that the university professors in Paris and Oxford were having about the nature of philosophy. They weren't interested because these weren't the questions of the Romans. These were not what were weighing down the discussions of Cicero and Virgil. Their interests, the Renaissance humanists' interests, were essentially artistic and literary in nature, or, on the flip side of the coin, very practical and about commerce, business, and politics. I mean, the most interest that they could generate, as we will see, was around a group of esoteric positions, so-called hidden knowledge positions that were of great interest to the alchemists and of great interest to the astrologers. That's exactly what we'll be talking about in a few minutes. So their speculations were not about can we know God through reason. The humanist speculations were more about examining the creative potential of the individual person. It was more about, hey, what can we do? It was a change. They weren't denying the topics of medieval philosophy. They were just shifting the camera angle away. It was just a change in focus, which is the way the world usually works. I mean, think of what public discourse was, whether it's political or artistic or God knows what, 20 years ago. It wasn't like we're now arguing that what we thought 20 years ago was wrong. It's that the camera focus has moved. The camera angle has changed. We're just looking in a different corner of the room. And now the new corner of the room for the humanist is, it's about us. What are we capable of? Who are we really? What dimensions are there in the human soul? I'm not so interested in the abstract, philosophical, theologically bounded discussions of the schoolmen. There's still a central place for religion in the Renaissance world, as we well know. But the style, the Renaissance style, was personal and mystical, not philosophical in that medieval sense. So I want to look at a couple of traditions that are very alive in the Renaissance. I'm not going to mention too many individuals, but there will be a couple who are mainline thinkers, because you don't think of Renaissance philosophers as having created a rich corpus of writing that people in the 20th and 21st centuries feel the need to read anymore. One such, though, Marsilio Ficino, who is at the court of the Medici. He's a client of Cosimo. He's a teacher of Lorenzo the Magnificent. He is a great text person. He's a great philologist. And he translates Plato from newly acquired Greek documents at the court of the Medici. Remember how Bessarion and other Greek scholars escaped from the collapse of Constantinople to the Ottomans and bring all these texts back to Italy, Venice, Rome, and Florence. and many of them bring back philosophical texts in their original form, the original Greek documents, and Ficino gets his hands on the Plato brought back to the court in Florence, and he translates Plato and becomes a fan of the ancient theory of forms, which I'll address in a second, and the Platonic concept that the soul is immortal. And this little aside in that top box on this side, if I could give a thumbnail sketch, Plato argues, as opposed to Aristotle, that fundamental reality was abstract, eternal, and unchanging, that there's this realm of ideas, idoi, forms, paradigms, that these ideas, for example, number is a kind of version of a form, are conceptual and not observable by the senses. The material world of sense data, the world of particulars, for Plato is a realm of imperfect, constantly changing copies. Things, if you think of the concept dog, there's a unifying concept, and all the dogs you've ever seen, you can ascribe this abstraction to, this universal, as the word that they, in the Middle Ages, they would have used for it. That language and knowledge deals in this realm of generals, and that each dog that you see, each individual, it does not reflect necessarily the details or the particulars of any other dog, but they share in this commonality, which the mind knows when it does. For Plato, when it internally fixes on the universal idea that for Plato had to exist outside of the world of the particulars. And the reason it did is that Plato could not understand how you could make the leap from the physical, how you could march 20 dogs past your eyeballs and somebody else could march 20 different dogs or 2,000 different dogs and come up with the same unifying idea. He says somehow there's this mysterious process by which the mind is tweaked using the Socratic method, is tweaked into remembering this idea that had to be planted in there. It's like Chomskyan theories of language. The baby can't learn these abstractions for Noam Chomsky and that school of linguistics just by looking at all the particulars in the world. That suddenly the kid makes a leap, and that leap is because the general concepts of language are deeply hardwired into the brain. It's a given. It's a starting point. And much of even modern philosophy through Descartes in the 17th century is taken with this idea of there's some stuff that works from the inside out, not from the outside in. And Plato was all about inside out, as Aristotle was all about outside in, that you use sense perception to build these abstractions. And for Plato, beyond the realm of these forms, there is the highest form of forms, which he calls the good. And you can see why religious figures in the ancient world love Plato, because they said, here is a philosophical explanation that even this pagan begins to intuit, through which this pagan begins to intuit the idea of God. He calls it the good. His follower, Plotinus, the famous Neoplatonist of the 3rd century AD, called it the one, the Tahen. And we'll look at Plotinus in a moment. And Augustine will say, don't you see these pagans were reaching for this ineffable, unknowable, ultimate concept called, we have through revelation learned that it is God who has revealed himself. The Word was made flesh, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God. In the 3rd century AD, Plotinus, in his famous The Enneads, meaning a group of 9 lectures, if you will, revives Platonism, and he tries to explain how the universe could be Platonic and account for physical reality as well. And the way he argues it is that the Godhead, or the One, which Christians call God, emanates down to lower formats, that all other reality, if you look at that bottom paragraph, the ideas, human souls, animals, plants, the whole hierarchy, if you will, inanimate objects, emanate from the One, and a great chain from more to less perfect. And that the desire at every level of being is to return to the One. And there's a little physical diagram, a little graphic diagram. So it's this world of absolute reality, which devolves into things that can be known at an abstract level or psychological level, and ultimately can devolve down to a physical reality, and that the attempt is always to transcend the way back up to the One. Now, Plato and everything Platonic definitely has this mystical bent to it. And the whole universe is seen as a kind of continuity in Neoplatonism. And that all of this mysteriousness about the ultimate foundation of reality had great play in the Eastern Mediterranean, in the ancient world. So that, and the Renaissance is going to try to recapture much of this, as we will see. So there's the tradition, sometimes called the Hermetica, the tradition of secret knowledge. And Ficino is a great believer in this and wants to rediscover and translate all the ancient Egyptian, Greek, so-called wisdom texts based on the legendary cult figure Hermes Trismegistus. Hermes, the thrice great, as he was called. And in fact, the Christian world was sufficiently obsessed with the idea that there were these secret wisdoms to be learned. Remember the Magi who show up at the birth of Christ? They're Magi. Each is a magus, a magician, come with secret wisdom from the world of Babylon. But here you have a floor panel from the cathedral in Siena, and it is a panel of Hermes Trismegistus. So he's associated with the Greek god Hermes and the Egyptian god Thoth, gods of knowledge, regarded throughout the medieval and the Renaissance period as a pagan prophet. There's a huge literature ascribed to Hermes, and they go all the way back to early papyri, if you will, in the Egyptian world of the 1st and 2nd century. And they're filled with things like magic spells and incantations and initiation ceremonies, because wisdom traditions were always about mysterion, a mystery. And the word mystery comes from mystes, which is the Greek word for an initiate. Someone had to be initiated into the secret knowledge, because the kind of mystery that always hangs around magic. Even magic acts now always try to look mysterious, don't they? Even when they're card tricks. But the mystery involved knowing something that was so richly powerful that it could not be put into the hands of people who could not use it or understand it, for whom it would be dangerous. You can't put this in the hands of children. You have to be initiated into it. And there was this ancient tradition, even within Christianity, even within Judaism, and with Sufi mystics, even within Islam, that picked up on the tradition of the Greek Hermetica. The Greek Corpus Hermeticum was the book that they all tried to translate, that suggested that, there was Christianity for the common man and Judaism for the common man and Islam for the common man, but for those who really wish to engage in the power of the hidden tradition, for instance, Kabbalah in Judaism is a continuity of this, as I will point out in a later slide, that there is a way that you purify yourself and come and find yourself a teacher and come to the great sources from the ancient world and learn the disciplines, the languages you're going to need to translate and get your hands on the secrets that will grant you power and grant you control. The universe is a hierarchy in this tradition. And so everything becomes a text. Even ancient Christianity, people like Augustine were obsessed with numerology. Why 40 days and 40 nights in the desert, 40 years in the desert? Why 40 days of rain? Why groups of three? Why 3 and 1? The idea was that God's messages were in everything, including the physical. This is why astrology, when you study intellectual history all the way up through the 18th century, this is why alchemy and astrology have to be taken very seriously, because the idea of, and people like Newton were astrologers and alchemists, because the belief was that everything is connected and therefore everything is text. The law of gravity is no more far-fetched than the idea that you could make gold out of base minerals. It is all a continuity. It is a universe that has secrets to it. Magic and science share the same foundation for the late medieval and Renaissance world. Here's an excerpt from the Greek Corpus Hermeticum. Leap clear of all that is corporeal. Get away from the body. One of the great Platonic prejudices is leave the body behind. Make yourself grown to a like expanse with that greatness which is beyond all measure. Rise above all time and become eternal. Then you will apprehend God. Think that for you too, nothing is impossible. Deem that you too are immortal, and that you are able to grasp all things in your thought, to know every craft and science. Find your home in the haunts of every living creature. Make yourself higher than all heights and lower than all depths. Think that you are not yet begotten, that you are in the womb. You haven't even been born yet, that you are young, that you are old, that you have died, that you are in the world beyond the grave. Grasp in your thought all of this at once, simultaneously, all times and places, all substances and qualities and magnitudes together. Then you can apprehend God. Ooh. It's a syncretic tradition. It's a tradition that picks up elements from Greek mystery cults in the Mediterranean from 500 years before the Common Era, from Christian Gnosticism, which was rooted both in mystery cults and in Christianity, in Neoplatonism. All those, Plato lent himself very easily to all these descriptions of secret knowledge and a higher realm, a realm beyond matter. Persian Zoroastrianism, the Magi were Zoroastrians, and Egyptian traditions of astrology and magic. Hermeticism, as it is called, was thought by many in the Renaissance to be a prisca theologia, that is, an ancient, single, true theology, a pure prisca theology that threads through all religions. And so you get people like the Byzantine philosopher that comes to the Medici court, Gemistos Platon, and we saw his in the Magi panel of the Medici. There is a portrait of Gemistos Platon. Introduced this tradition to the Medici court, and he firmly believed that Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Zoroaster, any religion worth 2 cents, was onto elements of the great secret pure religion that was at a higher level, and that they all indulged in. That it was the root of these expressions called Christianity and called Judaism and called Islam. Under the influence of Neoplatonism, all reality is seen as mysteriously interconnected, and special knowledge of initiates, mystes. Before you can know the mysterion, you have to be initiated, is required to harness the power in things. Now, this is an ancient way of looking at the world. And this slide, just a quick overview. The one thing when you start doing intellectual history is you start studying the history of one period, and you have to see how it's rooted in earlier traditions from all over the ancient world. So Greco-Roman, Egyptian, and Near Eastern sources of wisdom traditions and mystery cults expressed everywhere. Greek Orphism, cults of Orpheus, the Greek Eleusinian mysteries, of which this stele at the Metropolitan Museum, you get to see my 2 favorite things in the Metropolitan, the Studiolo, all in one course, the Studiolo, and here is the stele from Eleusis, an island off the east of Greece, sort of a peninsula more than an island. And it's the secret mystery cult of rebirth. Demeter, the grain mother, whose daughter Persephone is kidnapped by Hades and dragged off to the underworld. And so the world loses its fruitfulness, but Demeter negotiates with Hades that she can get her daughter back from the underworld for part of each year. And Persephone returns, and spring blossoms, primavera, the first season of planting. And we have this season of growth and fruit and fruition and rebirth and salvation, until Persephone must return to the underworld again for the winter, the long winter of Hades. And so there are common threads through, and there's the Knights of Kabiri and Serapis in the Near Eastern world, and Dionysus and Mithra and Isis in Egypt. There are all these North African traditions that are part of the same, if you will, world of wisdom traditions. And what they have in common, these common threads: all knowledge is esoteric and secret, reserved for the few who are sufficiently pure to receive it. It's a secret rite, it's a discipline or a liturgy through which the aspirant, the one who aspires to unite with the God in the higher state can enter in on the sacramentum, the holy thing that is the reuniting with the God. The act is often accompanied by exaltations or ecstasies, the Dionysian mysteries, the cults, the followers of Dionysus would get themselves into drug-induced and alcohol-induced stupors. The knowledge gained is thought to be supra-rational, above the rational. You go through an initiation process. You have to go through, undergo preliminary preparation, either through study or acts of purification, catharsis, the word for purification, to be equipped and to be worthy to be an initiate, a mystes. The uninitiated cannot be trusted with the secret power. And then after initiation, you are rendered more powerful. You are in tune with the universe. You can take your rightful place. The Roman Catholic Mass, or the Greek Orthodox Mass for that reason also, is organized around an initiation rite. So you have, if any of you were raised in Orthodox or Roman Catholic traditions, there was the part of the Mass, all the early part of the Mass, where you learn stuff. You read Gospels. There are letters from St. Paul. There's a sermon, a homily. And that's called the Mass of the catechumens, the people who are studying, the people who are being catechized, the people who are not yet initiated. And in the earliest tradition of the church, at that point, they had to leave before you could have the liturgy of the Eucharist and the turning of the bread and wine into the body of Christ. And it was mysterious. In the Roman Church, that this holy moment of the sacrifice is done with the priest, the celebrant, in the old Latin Mass, bent over the bread and wine and whispering the sacred formula, the hoc est enim corpus meum. And because it was whispered, was heard by people further out in the church in the Middle Ages as hocus pocus, which came to be a kind of derogatory version of the words of consecration. In the Greek Orthodox and Russian Orthodox traditions, the rite is so sacred that the priest, the celebrant, goes behind a screen, an icon screen, the iconostasis, and he stands behind the icons, and then he sings out, "This is my body," the voice of the God singing out from the mouth of the cave, "This is my body, and this is my blood." And then you have been initiated. Well, the Renaissance just fell in love with all this eclectic and syncretic, what my grandmother would call the jambota, a vegetable stew of religion, and the promise of secret knowledge, of Neoplatonism and Hermeticism and Gnosticism and Kabbalah and Sufism and various other strains of Christian and Jewish mysticism, all heavily influenced by the mystery cults and the wisdom traditions. Now, this is not anything more than a circle of humanist intellectuals that would be interested in such a thing, but interest there was. And part of it was really reflected in that medieval belief in the total connected hierarchy. Everything is connected, and therefore everything is text, which had a profound attraction for people who were discovering Roman and Greek texts for the first time. Everything is text. You just have to learn the language of the text. Science investigates all these hidden principles in the nature of things. Now we have string theory and quarks and God knows what. Well, you need the language to understand the text. And so, as there is at a simple level an actual text, the Pentateuch, the books of the Bible, the Quran, nature is itself a text. This is why astrology, this is why alchemy, it's all text. In the Jewish tradition of Kabbalah, letters and words have hidden meanings. In Hebrew, numbers represented by letters. So words have values, numeric values. All signs, all things are signs. All nature is to be examined the way all text is to be examined, and point to their ultimate source, God, the one, the good, whatever it's called, and your own little adaptation. As revealed text requires exegesis or explanation, so does the universe. And so traditions like Kabbalah they are attempts at explaining the actual universe. And here is an image of the Sephirot, the emanations, very Platonic, emanation, very Neoplatonic, in the Jewish tradition. Esoteric teachings meant to explain the relationship with God, the unchanging, eternal, and mysterious, and the finite universe. How is everything connected? Here's the Sephirot, the emanations of the Kabbalistic tree of life, emanations through which God reveals himself and continuously creates both the physical realm and the chain of higher metaphysical realms. So it's a conceptual paradigm for understanding everything. Now, a couple of people, other noteworthy figures in the Renaissance intellectual tradition. One, I wish we could do him more justice. He's such an interesting figure. And he's a cardinal. You see his little cardinal's hat here. Nicholas of Cusa, or Cusanus, as he is called. He's a mystical writer. He's suspected of pantheism, believing that God is present. The entire universe is God. Divinity is in all things in such a way that all things are in divinity, is a quote from him. The machine of the world will have its center everywhere, so to speak, and its circumference nowhere, because its circumference and its center are God, who is everywhere and nowhere. It sounds very much like the great Jewish philosopher of the 17th century, Baruch Spinoza. And the young Italian master, student of Marsilio Ficino at the court in Florence, the great Giovanni Pico della Mirandola. He only lives to be 31 years old. He is a kind of a polymathic linguistic genius. He masters, besides all the European languages and Latin, obviously, and Italian and whatever was passing for French and Spanish in this period, and German, he also masters Hebrew, Aramaic, and Arabic. And he's this voracious, eclectic reader of everything he could possibly get his hands on. He reads all of Plato and the Hermetic sources. And with another teacher, Elia del Medico, he studies Aristotle and various Hebrew and Arabic sources, including Kabbalah. Here is a little bit of a letter that from him to Ficino. Divine providence caused certain books to fall into my hands. These are Chaldean books. So they are these mystery books that come through the Zoroastrian tradition and were thought to be brought by Melchior, one of the Magi. They are Chaldean books of Esdras, of Zoroaster, and of Melchior, oracles of the Magi, which contain a brief and dry interpretation of Chaldean philosophy, but full of mystery. And he becomes the first exponent of a Christian Kabbalah. He's perhaps, as I call him here, the ultimate syncretic thinker, meaning syncretic means just to put pieces together from different sources and jam them all together in this kind of a cock-up of a new theory of the world. His worldview as a grand synthesis of Platonism, Neoplatonism, Aristotelianism, Hermeticism, and Kabbalah. And of course, he's featured, he's a favorite study of several painters of the period. They love to do portraits of him. Now, the worlds of magic and alchemy, and I'll have more to say about alchemy and astrology in the next session also, because as it becomes a tradition that influences the development of modern science. And I'll allude to it here, but we'll talk about it more head on when we talk about modernism in the final session. Natural magic is the tradition of magic that deals with natural forces. So astrology and alchemy, the two main branches. Astrology is considered a science in the Renaissance, on a par with astronomy and meteorology. And one of the reasons why astrology is so interested in human destiny, and why we commonly now think of pop astrology as having to deal with, predictions about one's destiny, is that the human body was thought to be a microcosm of the greater universe, the macrocosm, and so to understand anything about the universe was also going to be the way you came to understand something about the human individual. The microcosm and the macrocosm were just reflections one of the other. Attempts to control natural forces or use them for a prediction of human events. A conviction of universal interconnectedness, coupled with the belief that there were secret, hidden, esoteric explanations, was a fertile ground for science, proto-science, and pseudoscience. As I point out, and we'll talk about it more, how all of the early physicists, and certainly I list them here, several of the pioneering astronomers, Tycho Brahe, Johannes Kepler, Galileo, were court astrologers. That was part of their formal job. And it wasn't like they thought they were doing some kind of career scam on the side so that they could do real science in the back room. It was all, for them, a connected piece. Why not? Alchemy, a traditional alchemy, turning base metals into noble metals like gold, was key in the development of early modern medicine and early chemistry. It contributed scientific lab techniques, methodologies, terminology. Renaissance alchemy was influenced by Hermeticism and turned from physics to a broader occult framework concerned with the human soul. And we'll be looking at some of this. Because the desired transformation wasn't of a base chemical into gold. The desired transformation that alchemy wanted was the transformation of the individual person. It was really about human purification. Let's make ourselves golden. And of course, they all had maps of how the microcosm reflects the macrocosm, and the states of the individual person reflect the states of the universe. Occultism leaps off the ground in this period. Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa, he writes a book called De Occulta Philosophia, which is translated into several European languages, and it's suffused with magic, astrology, Kabbalah, and then, of course, the very famous Paracelsus. By the way, if you look at the birth dates and death dates of these guys, they're almost perfect contemporaries of Martin Luther and Desiderius Erasmus, the great humanist. I mean, not to mention also, Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci. They're like part of the same cohort group. These people ran in similar circles. Paracelsus, the great, I can't teach a class that mentions him without having to read his entire name, because who could believe it? Philippus Aureolus Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim, and there he is in the flesh, Paracelsus, pioneered the use of chemicals and minerals in medicine. Quote, many have said of alchemy that it is for the making of gold and silver. For me, such is not the aim, but to consider only what virtue and power may lie in medicines. The Hermetical view that sickness and health depended on the harmony of man and nature, that the microcosm has to become internally ordered the way the universe is ordered, is the way they explained theories of balance in the body, a balance of minerals in the body. And of course, there also was ritual magic, a ceremonial magic, spells, books of spells, grimoires, as they're called, and manuals for spells, charms, divinations, instructions on how to create talismans and amulets. This image on the right is the clavicula Salomonis, the key of Solomon, attributed, as many things in the mystery traditions, to the secrets of King Solomon and his temple. Invocation of magical operations to be performed by God, influenced again by Kabbalah and by the Arabic alchemists. Back to Pico, because now I want to switch gears. I wanted to create that impression of all the kinds of wild, eclectic thinking was going on in humanist circles, and how this brought back again and reflected a focus on the human being. And I come back to Pico della Mirandola again, because this kind of boy genius, because his theory was at once so, if you will, mysteriously, or rooted in the mysterious world of Hermeticism and in Christianity simultaneously. He argued that creation, the great chain of being, the creation of God, was complete without humanity. Remember, humans get created on the last day in Genesis. There were no missing links in the chain. You had everything from angels down to pet rocks. But God, in the Pico's formulation, God needed something to perceive, to love, and to stand in awe of this wonderful created whole. And having created everything from angels down to rocks, with animals in between and God knows what, and plant life, all the types, he had already exhausted his quiver. Every arrow in his quiver was shot. God had created examples of each thing. All the higher beings and all the lower beings already existed. So he creates, this is so Pico and so Renaissance. He created man as an indeterminate nature with no fixed place in the chain, neither animal nor angel, but both animal and angel, the body and the soul. The human has no fixed limits. So the human can either aspire to be angelic or can corrupt and degrade to become animalistic. All things become possible within the context of the great chain of the universe for man. This wonderfully creative vision of the individual human as self-determining, as at the center of the world, at the microcosm that reflects the entire universe. And here on the right is Vitruvian Man, the classic drawing of Leonardo. And man can choose to be angelic or bestial. Man has this self-determining capability, this creative orbit that they have for themselves. A quote from Pico: "A sacred pride should grip us of not being satisfied with the mediocre, but to strive for, we can do it if we want to, with the exertion of all our strength to attain the highest. Let us scorn what is of this earth," and you can see the Platonist bias towards the higher things. "Let us ignore what is of heaven. Let us leave absolutely everything worldly behind us in order to hasten to the abode out of this world, the proximity of the sublime deity. We do not need to think of stepping back, of being satisfied with second rank. Let us strive for dignity and glory to attain the highest." On the other hand, also a product of the study of the ancient world, another contemporary of a generation even younger, like he's like 20 years younger than Pico, is Machiavelli. And here is someone who just is, he's a humanist. He's not interested in all these underground religious traditions. His interest is in the world of hard politics. He's there reading, he reflects that practical side of Renaissance humanism that wants to read the philosophers like Xenophon and the historians like Xenophon and Thucydides, that wants to read the practical political thinkers like Cicero, and philosophers with a materialist or pragmatic bent like Democritus or Epicurus or Lucretius. And so for him, he also thinks that individual people are free agents and they have choices that they can make. However, for him, the sky is not quite the limit. There is this great chance element in the universe. As he says here, "Nevertheless, not to extinguish our free will, I hold it to be true that fortune is the arbiter of one half of our actions." Okay. Fortune, luck is half the deal, but that she still leaves us to direct the other half, or perhaps a little less. And so his great literary works like The Prince or the Discourses, which are advice to major political thinkers of the Italian Renaissance, is about how one gets to be successful, practically speaking, in the world of men, in the human world. And so he balances any idealism that he still has with political empirical reality. He rather talk about facts than values, and which makes him a very modern thinker. And the 18th century empiricists like David Hume always wanted to argue about ethics, about whether ethics was even possible. How do you come up with a necessary ought, something that people must do? What are the rules? I can talk about the is of the world and how people actually act, but how they ought to act by what authority, by what sanction. And so part of his advice to the prince is about practical questions. You want to be loved? You want to be feared? Make your choices based on that. I conclude, Niccolo Machiavelli, that men decide whom they will love. You can't make them love you. While the prince decides whom they will fear. You can make them afraid of you, though. And a wise prince will lay his foundations on what he controls, not what others control. Should a prince keep his word? This is the kind of thing that got Machiavelli, of course, in the subsequent 500 years, 600 years, in such trouble with moralists. So a prince needn't have all the good qualities I have listed, but he does need to appear to have them. And I go this far. To have those qualities and always act by them is injurious, and to appear to have them is useful. In other words, if you're always going to be honest and never tell a lie, that's probably going to hurt you in the long run. But if you can create the impression that you're honest and just shade things to your self-interest when it serves your purposes, that is to appear to be merciful, to appear to be trustworthy, friendly, straightforward, devout, and to be so while being mentally prepared to switch any virtue off if that will serve your purposes. So what do we have here? We have humans should aspire to be more godlike in Pico, and humans should use every trick in the publicist's book to make their way in the world and the Machiavellian universe. And what you have are various attempts to really focus on what the human is. And what in all of its manifestations, humanism has this, and the humanists had this built-in fascination with trying to figure out how we work and what we are and what we look like when we rip off the mask of cultural expectations and regard ourselves head on. And of course, one of the masters of doing that, not just in the graphics world, but generally, was Leonardo, the great Renaissance man, the uomo universale, the universal man, an artist, a sculptor, an architect, a musician, inventor, an engineer, a mathematician, a botanist, an anatomist, cartographer. We should do a course just on him one day. And written about him, marvelous and divine, indeed was Leonardo, the son of Ser Piero da Vinci. An erudition and letters, he would have distinguished himself if he had not been variable and unstable, for he set himself to learn many things. And when he had begun them, gave them up. I mean, he would invent weapon systems and arithmetic. During the few months that he applied himself to it, he made such progress that he often perplexed his master by the doubts and difficulties that he propounded. He gave some time to the study of music and learned to play on the lute, improvising songs most divinely. But though he applied himself to such various subjects, he never laid aside drawing and modeling and relief, to which his fancy inclined him more than to anything else. And his obsession with different aspects of the human personality. Leonardo was so pleased whenever he saw a strange head or beard or hair of unusual appearance, that he would follow such a person a whole day and so learn him by heart, that when he reached home, he could draw him as if he were present. There are many of these heads to be seen, both of men and women, such as the head of Amerigo Vespucci, the explorer, which is the head of an old man, most beautifully drawn in chalk, and also of Scaramuccia, that's Scaramuccia on the right, captain of the gypsies. Even then, Italy had its gypsy bands, and there is Scaramuccia. And of course, his obsession was with the grotesqueries of human potential. Because part of being fascinated by the question of who we are, not just what we ought to do and how we ought to be, but who we actually are, was to look into the dark corners of what we could become and present ourselves even physically to the world. And I included that famous quote from the Roman playwright Terence, Homo sum humani nihil ame alienum puto. I am a man. I think nothing human is alien to me. I am all of these things, and I am all of these people. And if you look at them individually, you see something universal in all of us. Leonardo's painting technique also reflected his fascination with what we might be. His use of sfumato, smokiness, creating the sense of mystery in his portraits. So instead of using, as he himself says, and talking about sfumato, without lines or borders and the manner of smoke or beyond the focus plane. So a kind of a fudge factor, a mysterious unclarity around the borders of things. So this is a quote from a famous art historian, E.H. Gombrich. The painter must leave the beholder something to guess. If the outlines are not quite so firmly drawn, if the form is left a little vague, as though disappearing into a shadow, this impression of dryness and stiffness will be avoided. Everyone who has ever tried to draw or scribble a face knows that what we call its expression rests mainly in two features, the corners of the mouth and the corners of the eyes. Now, it is precisely these parts which Leonardo has left deliberately indistinct by letting them merge into a soft shadow. And so we have Mona Lisa with the famous mysterious smile. So humanism and the nature of man is in Leonardo's application is the wedding of science and technique to mystery and obscurity. So the human personality is created, or the image of it is created as a suggestion of depths that are not there on the surface of the painting. And it's done through this incredibly ornate mastery of technique, this colossal mastery of technique as we see in the Mona Lisa. And he does it in all of his, not all of them, but many of his very famous paintings and frescoes. The Salvator Mundi of Christ, which sold a couple of years ago for like, well, what the hell was it? It was like $500 million or something like that. And if I zoom in again, you see the sfumato, the melting of the features into obscurity, and a detail from the Virgin of the Rocks by Leonardo. And while we're here, we looked at several portraits in the period, but portrait painting became a kind of Renaissance obsession. Sometimes they used the device of painting people's portraits into religious scenes to carry on the tradition of religious painting, or that the historical scenes like the Medici Magi portraits where you're looking at the celebration of the Greeks coming to the Florentine court, but also not. Also just straight portrait painting of course, of nobles and patrons, but right down to middle-class people, right down to grotesques, as we looked at already. And often these portraits, we looked at a couple of Holbeins already with his great rendering of individual figures and the suggestion of what lays in under the surface. But many were capable of this. So here we have a couple by Raphael, but the Doge Leonardo Loredan by Giovanni Bellini, one of the great portrait painters. And again, we get this showing off, the collectors showing off the clothing that they could command, this surplice or whatever you would call this gown that the Doge is wearing with its magnificent inlay and the like, and the Doge's hat, which has a name, which eludes me, but I'm sure somebody will look it up. Oh, excuse me, I'm going to get back here. Pope Julius, looking much beleaguered, Julius II, and was much beleaguered because he could never get Michelangelo to finish the damn ceiling in the end of the Sistine Chapel, and was always complaining to him about it. Another Raphael, Baldassare Castiglione, the writer of the Courtier, in a book of advice on how to be a proper, educated humanist courtier at a court. So images of power and authority and remembrance. And this quote from Ippolita, the wife of Castiglione: "Only your portrait, painted by Raphael's hand, bringing back your features, comes near to relieving my sorrows after his death. I make tender approaches to it. I smile, I joke or speak, just as if it could answer. This is my solace, and thus I cheat the long days." And so this is a real portrait. This has captured enough of Castiglione for his wife to take solace in it. Whoever Castiglione was, she knows, and she wants to suggest here Raphaello had an inkling. And of course, court painting. And we're back with Holbein did several Henry VIII's. The one on the left is actually his, and he captures that smash mouth, in your face quality that Henry liked to project. And again, look at the attention to detail, the jeweled garments and that stance, which and the one on the right, which captures his. He always stood oddly because of a kind of gamey leg from a dueling injury that he had. This is actually a copy of a Holbein, but they believe it was sufficiently faithful. And again, we see that in-your-face attitude of Holbein's. And many portraits in the period develop and utilize the technique of the subject staring back into, engaging us, an assertion. I am this person. Look at me. I am looking at you. Understand your own selfhood as you regard my selfhood. The eyes have it. Can the portrait be, as they would have it, a window into the soul? And so we have portrait of a gentleman. We don't know who it is. Ghirlandaio. We have La Belle Ferroniere by Leonardo. Several portraits of noble women, and this marvelous portrait of a man by Antonello Damasceno. And again, you see a person, and as you would never have seen in medieval art. I mean, you would have, in medieval art, of course, you always had, there might be a person, but it was the person as some cipher or symbol in a religious narrative. And it was about the narrative, not about, tell me more about this person. But here it is. From the Roman poet Martial, would that art could have painted his character and his mind. The Romans had the same interest. There would then be no fairer portrait in the whole world. Renaissance portrait artists suffused with the values of the ancient world and their newly adopted humanist outlook wanted to capture this Roman sentiment. We want to see who we are. And self-portraits, this is the age of artists putting themselves either in scenes that they're doing for somebody else, or as the entire focus of the work. So the great Jan van Eyck, and here he is, man in a red turban, done probably around 1440. Here are two by Dürer, one where he's in the fancy dress of his class, if you will, being somebody who's made his way in the world and holds positions at courts, and one where he's a kind of a Christ-like figure, again suggesting depths of his interest. And what do we know? We know he was a assiduous follower of Martin Luther and a good Christian man. The humanistic nature of man goes off in every direction, that humans are free and self-determining, but they're also at the mercy of fortune. They're individuals with many talents and faces that can look even grotesque. They're both mysterious on one side, which suggests difficulty to know or to be known, if indeed they're knowable at all. But at the same time, they're books to be read. You're to look into their eyes and try to engage them. And they're selves. And in this last slide, I just want to do this contrast. We're going to talk more about how Christianity of the Reformation period and these interests in alchemy and astrology and the new science became part of a complex, layered world that even yielded skepticism and modern sensibilities. But here, I just wanted to, before we left, suggest that this obsession with personality and human capability, even in a world of traditional Christianity, could make leaps that were novel and therefore had feet in both worlds. So on the left, you have a Bautz portrait from the 1490s of Mary, the sorrowful Mary at the cross of Christ. And it's got a lot in common with medieval personal religion. But on the right, from 1520, this Quentin Massis, who's a wonderful portrait artist, this portrait of a woman at prayer, that's her prayer book, and it's so far from the traditional treatment of piety. She's distracted. What you see, and look at the way the window becomes a kind of a portrait frame of its own, and she seems to be stepping out of the painting or projecting out of the painting. But here you have, this is not the face of the worshiper. This is the face of the person who happens to have a side of her that is the worshiper, clearly, and she's got the prayer book in her hands. But here she is, so real that she has stepped out into the world. She's broken the, the fourth wall, and she's entered your living room. I am here to be engaged. I am this woman, this human on this side of the screen. Anyhow, that's what I wanted to do today. So I will stop that. I will, oops, let me unpin myself. And anybody who wants to chat about any aspect of this or make a point, be my guest. Because otherwise we're down to the last session coming up next week.
Lou, thank you very much for that. And it was enlightening. What I found most interesting was the extent to which mysticism played a role in thinking during the medieval period, the Renaissance, and entering the Renaissance, and how everything was tied together in some ways. It's just a comment.
Well taken. Okay, gang. What we'll do is gather again next week. I will send out my usual, I will post this when it gets up on the YouTube site. I will send out a PDF that is cumulative through the first 5 sessions. And the last one, the one I'll send after next week's class, of course, will be the entire deck. And that'll be it. Anyhow, have a good week. We'll see you then.
See you soon.